Hello and welcome to the Radical Engagements. And today we're going to finish uh, Scott Nappalos' Democratic Centralism in Practice and Idea. Don't start with this one. This is the fourth in a series, and I've also been covering other things on this topic that I would think you would need to come to because there are some mistakes I feel in this essay, or at least some conflations. Nappalos seems to think that vanguard partyism and democratic centralism pretty much amount to the same thing. Even though they generally went together, they're not the same thing. And we need to separate that out. All right, conclusion and practice. A better way of political organization than the Stalinist hierarchy needs to be found, but the underlying project, cohering a revolutionary-minded activist into a collective body of cadre, remains crucial for the task of obstructing any effective left. Well, we talked about that. I mean, the base building series was also about the problems around that. So, anyway. For generations of radicals attempting to build a revolutionary movement that can change capitalism, neither the legacy of communist movements nor its theories have been neutral. I mean, no theory is neutral. The challenges of building a revolutionary movement in our conjecture has a negative synergy with the centralizing impulses that drive democratic centralism. Simply put, the challenges of organizing outside of time of movements and with little historical legacy passed from previous generations are forces that push people towards centralizing shortcuts that they hope will generate the necessary struggle. In fact, typically the opposite occurs. The struggles are held back by the conservative and dominating tendencies within the group. Are just by conservative, I don't think it just means ideologically conservative. I think it means like trying to conserve their own position within the hierarchy of a group. While we should not conclude that such reprehensible activity as seen above is automatically driven by democratic centralist theory, because it isn't, we should recognize that such tendencies reside deeply within democratic centralism as a potential, and in fact cannot be cleaved from it simply by critiquing bureaucracy or applauding democracy. While this browsing of recent history is inherently incomplete and selective, extremely on both, I will add, taking a broad view, we can see that it raises serious challenges for anyone trying to revise democratic centralism away from its bureaucratizing and centralizing orientations. We need to separate centralizing and bureaucratizing because they're not actually the same thing, but they are related. It isn't that such examples are the only type of democratic centralism, but rather that the fights and deviations occur around the central axis of democratic centralism that expose its inherent weaknesses. Democratic centralism outside of time and space, aka as an idea. Not all democratic centralists embrace Leninism, however. By Leninism, I think they mean here vanguard partyism, and that's not Lenin. That's Second International. Some groups in Latin America have rejected their identification with Marxism and Leninism and instead called themselves democratic centralists and dialectical materialists with other identifications. This was common because of the bad press of Marxism after 1992. There's a possibility of arguing that everything I described is actually bureaucratic centralism and that democratic centralism was not practiced historically, even though people claimed it. For instance, the Puerto Rican Socialist Workers Movement, the MST, criticized such a concession. The good old, it was never tried, right? No true Trotsman argument, right? Anyway, long quote from the MST. We socialists who aspire to contribute to a unifying broad sectors of the working class and people in one or several mass organizations, fronts, or movements seeking political power can't even ponder the possibility that if we're wedded to an organizational conception according to which, in order to fight for a common goal, all members of an organization must obey a position, even if the larger sector doesn't agree with it. Such a conception not only attempts to homogenize, neglecting the existing heterogeneity, but by means of a majority vote, even worse, converting democratic centralism into a fundamental criteria for being part of an organization, it sacrifices the concrete contributions that the minority sector can make in those aspects where there is agreement, unquote. Unlike the Bolshevik conception where democratic centralism is a property of organizations, i.e. democratic centralist organizations, this argument holds that democratic centralism is merely a process or a method for the internal functioning of a revolutionary organization. E.g., organizations that do or don't practice democratic centralism as a process, but their are no democratic centralist organizations. Under such a conception, democracy is a collective process by which we come to have unity, and centralism is where we develop a common course of action, position, or line. The MST, for example, rejects the discipline of minorities to the majority, traditional to the most democratic centralist organizations. Unquote. Adherence to the socialist political action is a voluntary act, freely agreed upon, but shouldn't be mediated by coercive threats or by disciplinary measures. Discipline in a socialist organization is a conscious mechanism that allows the unification of the individual wills to struggle for the collective goals. We convinced that once a decision has been taken, the majority, who voted in its favor, should have the main responsibility of putting it into practice. The majority, who voted against it, should have the option of standing by it or not. I mean, they always do, they can leave. The organization should not force anyone under the threat of disciplinary measures to stand by a decision that may harm the principles of conscience of one or more of its members. The dialectic between democracy and centralization supposedly would yield a more democratic organization than other methods because of the engagement of all in the decision, the struggle, and the back and forth between practice, idea, and unity. Notably absent is a commitment to central bodies with directed powers. This would seem to solve some of the problems above by eliminating the conflations of power and position, centralism and unity, etc. The problem is that this is not democratic centralism and fails to answer the problems of organizing by simply trying to cleave the historical baggage that surrounds the concept. This argument is fundamentally flawed because it attempts to take a material concept rooted in history, abstract away all context, and put into its place another. Behind every intellectual move like this, there's an objective reality. Democratic centralism did not come out of nowhere. No, it didn't. I mean, it's very specific, actually. It came out of the Second International. But was a concept built in the struggle which developed its own tradition, theorists, and practices. An attempt to contest that tradition and argue for another needs to base itself not merely on asserting a different semantic meaning, but on real practices engaging with how theory developed, where it came from, and why this theory of democratic centralism is just that and not some other theory. Moreover, if ambiguities plague the theory itself, simply culling away the bureaucratic elements of the theory doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll avoid the worst of the centralizing tendencies. That is, if we do not offer a clear alternative to why democratic centralism tended to produce repressive bureaucratic structures, we may simply reproduce it. The tyranny of structurelessness itself is also a problem. I need to cover that one day. All right. Furthermore, politically, this is questionable. First, why attempt to ahistorically reconstruct a theory at all? If there is a recognition of the need to pull a theory away from the tradition that elaborated it, why not abandon the problematic concept as well? Why is it better to keep democratic centralism and try to argue against everything that it was separate from the history and people who develop it? Second, why do so without any attempt to engage that debate, instead merely cascading the actual democratic centralist tradition as bureaucratic centralist, basically the renaming something so that you don't have to deal with it fallacy. If we level attacks on the theory, it is better to engage that the tradition and offer an alternative than it is merely to excommunicate it or semantically change definitions, which is pretty common. Third, can it even be taken seriously at all when someone attempts to put forward ideas which claim a historical concept but fail to engage or even acknowledge the context out of which it was born? It borders on being unprincipled and intentionally misleading. Hear, hear. The response that the horrors of Russia or China were not democratically centralist is unsatisfying. It attempts to skirt the real issues by creating semantic moving targets. I mean, words are semantic moving targets, but I see the problem here. These are the problems inherited when we attempt to take up these tools uncritically and attempt to brush real problems under the rug without confronting them. Merely using a label, bureaucratic centralism, or the foreign worker state, or whatever, to attack practices you don't like, and democratic centralism for those that you do, fails to address the actual important debates that produce both insights and errors. This is essentially idealist, or idealist nominalist even. That's me adding that. And works against the best of the revolutionary movement, which is an attempt to ground our ideas in the concrete movements of popular crises, its history, and its tendencies and traditions of struggle. Worse, it seems to obscure the errors and failures of democratic centralism in a time when we desperately need to move beyond them. rather than to pass over them in silence. The fallout is that we would be inventing a new theory while using the name from another history. This gives legitimacy and space to the real problems that exist within the tradition and disarms ourselves against those practices. But it puts us only in a position to argue for the real democratic centralism against the real bureaucratic centralism that borders on religious or canonical exercises less than real revolutionary work, or at least just semantic exercises. Since there are other concepts, other traditions, and work within the struggles of the proletariat that are outside, against, and beyond democratic centralism, there is little reason to keep the flawed concepts and uncritically inherit the baggage that poisons the benefits. The ambiguity around the elements of democratic centralist theory creates real problems. These are not problems which can be merely avoided by refining the terms. We need different concepts and practices altogether. Democratic centralism in our time. Whatever may be said of democratic centralism, and it should be rejected, the movement that led to its development are radically distinct from our situation. Yeah, we are not in 1914 or 1917 or 1905 in Russia. If we look at the burst of democratic centralism and its maturation, neither case is analogous to our own. We do not live in a political climate of Russia or Italy in 1905 or 1919, or the economic climate of China in 1939 or 1950. Taking in its most broad and dilute form, we can learn from the necessity of having an internal process and a life of an organization coming to unity, deciding on that unity, and being serious and committed to executing our plans based on the collective democracy. This is too general to be called democratic centralism without making everyone already democratic centralist. But it is a basic theory shared with non-authoritarian traditions and can be seen as a diamond that we can extract from the rough. Moreover, its insights lost on the most democratic centralists, given the dangerous conflations of professional revolutionaries, centralization, and discipline. Notice, see that I said that professional revolutionaries is not inherently part of democratic centralism, but it is part of the actual groups that came up with it, so I guess he might have somewhat of a point here. The more crass and most popular form of democratic centralism, with its submission of the base of the party to the decisions of a central committee with mandate powers, would fare and does fare miserably in our environment. Though countless publications today try to argue that practicing democratic centralism will solve gaps in consciousness and practice, disorganization, and the failure of social movements and practice, we see the opposite. I mean, he has a point there. It's not like most of these movements have been successful. That is, if one is even able to do the mental gymnastics necessary to ignore the role in bringing about the repressive state capitalist disasters. You got to prove that they're state capitalists. You can't just assert it. It is totally unclear how this would be a useful method for building a revolutionary organization now, given that the left itself is deformed and isolated, and its theory starkly abstracted from praxis. Democratic centralism stultifies the situation, focusing on a centralizing leadership when the leadership itself is isolated, lacks practice, and reflects all the problems of the dominant society, is a recipe for malice. Yeah, it is. This is one of my issues. There's a difference between a political sect centralizing leadership and a revolutionary party doing so. Not that that is less problematic either, but yeah, I actually think there's a huge difference between a small political sect of a few thousand people or less doing this and then trying to claim to be a mass party, and a revolutionary party that has hundreds of thousands in it doing this. There's a massive difference. It's a logical leap to assume that mimicking Lenin's party in our time will have similar effects as the time it arose out of. Yep. In fact, this approach risks or guarantees centralizing deformed leadership and making concrete the left's alienation from struggle. By fetishizing the institutionalized political center in a time of deep left alienation, democratic centralism intensifies the worst dynamics of isolated microsects. Democratic centralism in our time, then, is even more problematic. I think the microsect point actually stands. I wish this essay was more about that. Trotskyist analysis of the crisis of leadership in the working class makes the problem still worse, since theirs is already a crisis of leadership of the left. Merely codifying the leadership with democratic centralism makes the problem worse. Historically, we can see how this has not worked out in practice either, as the revolutionary leadership of Trotskyists and unions in the US has yielded a reformist practice. The Teamsters are the are the Trotskyist Union. I mean, they're not Trotskyists anymore, haven't been a long time, but that's their origins. Despite 80 years of attempts to capture and lead the unions, when that leadership was achieved, usually by the reformers became the reformist, and in many cases, repressed workers struggled just as revolutionary leadership of those institutions did. Whatever merit may be said of having left leadership of business unions, not much. It is clear that the leadership, in a few places it was successful, evaporated in positions of power or left us little revolutionary legacy we can point to as successes. I think the latter point stands. That strategy has left us merely as the same organ of reformism, repression, and stagnation towards fresh organization. All right. This is what Nappalos thinks we should be doing. To solve the tensions of bureaucracy and repression endemic to democratic centralist practice, we needed different concepts and different practices. Okay. Indeed, this problem itself is bigger than democratic centralism. Yeah, I think you've included things that aren't democratic centralist in the concept, actually, but go ahead. Like any section of human history, we can and must learn from the experiences that emerge from such movements. There are positive elements that speak to our situation today, but as we have seen, democratic centralism carries with it an inherent dangers that demand a critical departure. Likewise, the Marxist tradition historically hit a fork in the road with organization. The four main currents of Marxist political organization all ran aground by the end of the last century. Social democracy, which Marx and Engels helped found, eventually lost all illusions of revolution, if it ever had any. Much of its original social democratic forces moved to reformist gradualism of change within the capitalist state. Most of them even abandoned Marxist economics. And in most cases came to embrace the market and capital from the halls of power, even neoliberalized significantly from it. Indeed, today, it is social democracy that is amongst the driving forces of austerity and neoliberalism, even if apologetic, and this is true from Europe to India and Latin America. Amongst revolutionary Marxist thought, Foucault or guerrilla theory and Leninism remain, which are the bastions of democratic centralism. The failures of Foucault theory in Latin America, guerrilla movements across the past decade appears to have added in its waning. Marxist-Leninism itself, while still significant, has suffered enormous blows with the decline of the Soviet bloc, collapse of the Soviet bloc at this point, and China's embrace of Marxist capitalism. On the libertarian side, most of the Marxist ultra-left, except for the Bordegists who embrace a cousin of Leninism purge of its democratic elements, abandoned organization altogether in favor of spontaneous revolution and our determinist ideas of revolution as a form of revolutionary destiny. Communization. Political and mass organizations alike are seen to carry inherent reformist or reactionary potential, which bars the door, or at least until the spontaneous emergence of revolutionary formations amongst the working class. Instead, ultra-left thinkers, it's funny having anarchists call people ultra-left, but fair, turn to the internal dynamics of capital itself to deliver revolutions, either through evolutionist and developmentalist ideas, which is even true amongst many Marxist-Leninists today, are through immiseration. And the how it does it is different, but the logic of it doing it is the same. And I think it's basically eschatological. Eschatology means the study of things future. It's what it really refers to apocalypticism. Consequently, amongst most counterlists in the ultra-left, no theory of organization remains. Even the experiments with workers' organizations of their early eras have been abandoned, although some have tried to be picked back up after this was written. Leninist substitutionism, the party substitutes itself for the class, and ultra-left faith in spontaneous revolution illuminates the spectrum of the problem. Faced with the historical defeats of the 20th century, the present state of Marxism reveals deep tensions in trying to construct answers. Building organizations beyond substitution, bureaucratism, authoritarianism, or reformism. Faced with the dead ends of social democracy, the bureaucratic centralist tradition of Leninist-inspired movements, and the determinist face of libertarian Marxist currents, Marxism indeed today faces a crisis of organization. And kind of still does, actually, even though this is almost from 20 years ago, I think. There are other experiences we can draw from, however. Separated by continents and decades in time, the organized anarchist communist movement came to similar conclusions in their struggles. It's not like these organizations tended to win. The Korean anarchist communists in Manchuria became nationalist. All right. The Chinese Shifuists, the Korean anarchist communists in Manchuria, the Uruguayan and Argentinian specifists, the European platformists, and the Italian dual organizationalists put forward libertarian conceptions of organization based on the ruptures from 1917 to the 1970s. I don't know that any of these worked. Just, I'm going to add that there. Organizations failed, so we're going to try organizations that didn't even begin to fail. Doesn't usually seem to be a good line to stand on. Built from the deepest revolutions to have challenged capital in the 20th century, this broad tradition represents a global praxis of organization apart from the reformist and authoritarian experiences. Common to all is a concept of libertarian organized action with common strategy, analysts, and goals that is at once strategic and based on collective democracy. Okay, how does it work, though? That's vague. That's actually vaguer than what you're critiquing. Democratic centralism raises real questions for anti-authoritarians as well, of course. In the revolutionary situation of repression, how can we address the unevenness in our forces? How can we maintain the democratic decisions of collectives while uniting to create communism directly? Though the answers are flawed, it is dangerous to out of hand dismiss the problems. Here, the anarchist communist tradition has a lot to give. First, there is the concept of organization as a pole for development of ideas and the struggle of the popular classes. Rather than a hierarchical conception of a direct minority, the tradition sees the very function of organization to multiply capacity, and that the leadership is about libertarian pedagogical relationships of developing praxis through the back and forth between ideas and actions. That's not that different from democratic centralist praxis, dude. Rather than institutionalizing leadership into a professional party class, anarchist communist organizations integrated an educational method for their work as rank and file social movement militants, and internally through trying to elevate all members and counteract the reproduction of class, race, and sex hierarchies transmitted in capitalist and statist relationships. Okay, but be specific on how you do that. You're critiquing something on specifics, then you give us very vague notions of, things you need to do. Sure, you need to do that, but how? Second, this tradition offered the idea of unity through collective accountability. And theoretically, that's true in early democratic centralism too. Recognizing the need for coordination and strategy does not imply necessarily specialized authorities that either impose or theorize it. Anarchist communist organizations develop practice around the bottom-up accountability and horizontal coordination of revolutionary struggle. Experiences in Spain, Uruguay, and Italy, for example, have shown both the power and necessity for overcoming the false dichotomy of the intervention of minorities in insurrectionary movements with the imposition of the will of a directed minority. Are you talking about the Cardenas system in Chile? I mean, what are you talking about here? Be more specific. Lastly, anarchist communist organizations have shown the ability to create models for building revolutionary currents, not just in the heat of the barricades during revolutions, but in our time in core and periphery countries and to changing realities. I will throw Vincent Bevan's book, which I don't love, but it's definitely taking aim at this, at your face. Rather than seeing organizations as a timeless method, I agree. The organization should not be timeless. There's a recognition of different tasks, educational movement, insurrectionary in different times. Bolsheviks did that too. Revolutionary democratic centralism wasn't used during the underground periods at all. Distinctions between concepts like social work and social insertion, the battle of ideas, and the question of different conjectures and phases spread across the literature. Instead of a project of trying to resurrect a purified version of democratic centralism, we need our own theory that can break apart the ambiguities and make elaborate revolutionary process of mass struggle and revolutionary development. To do so in a time of low struggle, ruling class assaults, and the alienation of the left from practice requires theory for our time. No such theory or practice will come prepackaged, and no critique will provide us with a perfect shield. Still, through understanding democratic centralism and alternatives, we can better prepare to building our own. Like, what are alternatives? Just straight up normal democracy, what does it mean? You know, other than celebrating groups that you like as, being successful. And I don't know that they were. I don't even know what the criterion of success is here. So while I agree with some of the critiques of democratic centralism, or at least the way it was used in sectarian formations in the United States, I think when you go back into its early history, it's a lot more ambiguous than even presented here. I don't see how a lot of these things get you out of it. Maybe democratic centralism is redundant because if you abide by an organization's rules, then you have to go with the majority vote. That would be a centralizing organization. I think maybe the issue is stuff like central committees and stuff like that, and that does seem to be tied to democratic centralism, but it's not inherent in the principle. But it could be that democratic centralism is just democracy, and we should, or just democracy if you have a central apparatus, and we should have to deal with the problems around that. Or maybe we need to talk about the more specific issues that came up in specific sectarian formations, because it wasn't just democratic centralism that all these things shared. Nonetheless, I don't really have a good answer for this, and I think we're going to have to go into more history about what this concept actually meant and how it developed, and maybe looking at the German side of things, not just the Russian, because the German side of things is where it came from. All right, and on that note, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment or not. We have more behind the Patreon wall, and protect your peace.